As the managing director of the Cultural Foundation of German Expellees, I'd like to cordially welcome, together with a friend, to the second day of our online conference, Minority Protection Ethnic Group Rights, with a special consideration to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. My special thanks and greetings are extended to our today's presenters, Dr. Beate Sibylle Pfeil, German representative in the expert commission to the European Charter of the Regional and Minority Languages at the European Council and board member in the European Center for Minority Issues. Professor Dr. Bernd Fabricius, the Commissioner of the federal government for matters related to ethnic German resettlers and national minorities, Dr. Magdalena Lemanczyk, a professor at the Institute for Political Studies of the Polish Academy of the Sciences, and regional coordinator of the Association of German Social Cultural Societies in Poland. Bernhard Greider, the speaker of the Working Group of German Minorities in FUIN and the chair of the Association of the German Social Cultural Associations in Poland. State Secretary Laciku Eneki Katalin, State in the Romanian government for interethnic relations. Dr. Paul-Jürgen Paul, chair of the FDGR in Romania. Professor Dr. Mitja Jagar, professor at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, and a long time actor at the Institute of Ethnic Studies, and Laura Sorgo, a research assistant at the Institute for Ethnic Studies in Ljubljana. Our today's moderator is Professor Dr. Given Gornik from Marburg University, who also chairs the study group Politics and International Law, and deals with the Cultural Foundation of the German Expellees. He essentially contributed to provide a concept for our online conference today. This 2 days online conference is supposed to draw an overall picture of minority protection and ethnic minorities' rights from a practical perspective of politics and science. Yesterday focused on urgent questions of minority protection. The greetings by Dr. Varen from the UN Special Rapporteur, and Dr. Stefan Meyer as Subsecretary, and all the other contributions from the viewpoint of the European Council, the Parliament, German politics, and minority representatives underlined that disadvantages and exclusion of minorities are heads for conflicts which we need to fight. Minority politics means we need complete equality and not just acceptance. On the second day, we're going to focus on the countries Germany, Poland, Romania, and Slovenia. And we're going to start with a look at the legal regulations and thereafter their practical implementation. We're going to collect the questions of participants, and at the end, they're going to be answered by the presenters. I'm sure that this specialized or expert conference will contribute to provide an overview from scientific and practical and legal views or purposes as to how the agreements by the European Council and other contracts could contribute to lift up the level of minority protection. I thank you very much for your participation. I would like to hand over the mic to the welcome greetings by the Commissioner of the Prime Minister in Matters of National Minorities and Ethnic Groups, Borderland Work and Low German, Johannes Kausen. Thank you very much. Dear Laurent Vince, dear Mr. Vogler, ladies and gentlemen, minority politics is preventive peace politics. This quote by Federal President Frank-Walter Steinmeier puts a highly important aspect to the foreground in minority politics, because the point is not just to react to emerging problems. It's much more important to take preventive measures to protect our minorities. We need to listen to one another, be understanding, and to heed what the others say. That's the only way to continuously expand our relationships and show a long-term interest in a positive minority politics. We in Schleswig-Holstein have worked with our national minorities and linguistic minorities on a peaceful collaboration for many years, and a lot has been achieved. However, work is nowhere near being finished. It's of great importance to stay in contact and continuously signalize we listen, we want positive change, we walk this path together. It's equally important for the member states to exchange views of EU member states to exchange views about their experience in minority politics, because that's the way to learn from one another, to listen to our minorities and to support cross-border exchange. Minority politics shouldn't just be advanced on regional, national levels. It's essential to get together at the European level. In the European Civil Initiative Minority Safe Pact, for instance, lots of Europeans met to reach this common goal. Schleswig-Holstein's parliament and the Prime Minister Daniel Günther too supported this initiative. The International Conference for Minority Protection and the Rights of Ethnic Groups in Central and Eastern Europe offers a really important platform for this. At this point, I'd like to extend my special thanks to FUEN and the Cultural Foundation of German Ex-Police for Science and Research for organizing this conference. The meeting of representatives of politics, science, national minorities guarantees a broad exchange. This provides us the opportunity to get together and learn from one another, because together we'll be able to reach so much more at the European level. It's upon us and our fellow citizens to bring about positive and above all lasting change in minority politics. That's the only way to ensure a sustainable, peaceful coexistence. Heartfelt greetings from Kiev and all the best success for this conference. Yeah, Mr. Carlson showed us how important, or the importance of exchange, the exchange that we started yesterday and we're going to continue today. And in this sense, I'd like to hand over the mic of our today's moderator, Professor Dr. Gornig. Thank you very much, Mr. Kronhäuser. I hope you can all understand me. Welcome to everybody, and in particular, Professor Hilpult in Innsbruck. It's great that you're here today and that you'll be able to learn the one or the other thing about minorities and international law. Yesterday, we dealt with minority protection from a view of international law, and allow me to say, as a lawyer in the field of international law is a legal order just like any other legal orders are. It's not a soft law, it's an ordinary law that can be enforced. And as Professor Hippold said yesterday, we saw that the different legal instruments that we have at our disposal at the international level allow to review things in minority protection and check whether states meet or comply with the regulations. We do have different tools for that in the framework of international conventions, but also within OSZE. And minority protection, as said yesterday, is a protection of human rights of individuals in the minority, but the minority is can or should not just be equal or not disadvantaged. They need a special protection, and this special protection must be guaranteed by the state. That is, there is a positive discrimination, that is support to the individual members of the minority in order, for instance, to support them preserving their traditions, to use their language in public and privacy, and also to have their religious messages in their own languages. These things are stipulated by international law, but I have to point to the fact that, of course, states are free to regulate minority protection on their own. They can also include other minorities that we may not consider in international law, and also exceeding the status is possible. That is, it's a minimum status, and the individual states can, of course, offer much more than that. Now, today, we've got a number of states that we can have a closer look at. We're going to continue this conference next year, if possible, in the Hungarian embassy. So this minority protection will shed light on the minority protection in Germany, Poland, Romania, and Slovenia. And the aim of this event is to show what are the regulations that individual states have and what are the obligations they have on an international level and what are the national regulations they provide in, let's say in Germany, for instance, individual lands. And the second part is supposed to check, do states do they accept and respect these points? When it comes to Germany, we do have a minor problem because Bernd Fabricius, who was supposed to talk about practice in Germany, is not present. And that's why we are going to show a video clip, and only thereafter Dr. Beate Sibylle-Pfeil is going to discuss regulations. That is, we do it the other way around than planned. Let's have this video part by Mr. Fabricius now. I am delighted to be present here at your conference, Minority Protection in Central and Eastern Europe. And that is very important to be here. I thank FUIN and the Cultural Foundation for their consistent attempts to improve minority protection. Lots of minorities are here in Germany, like the Danish minority Frisians and the German Sorbs and Sinti and Romanish. The represent or part, national minorities are an important part of German society. They've developed their own language, habits, cultural identity over hundreds of years. As national minorities, they are recognized in Germany those who fulfill the following criteria. Their members are German citizens. They differentiate themselves or are distinguished by the majority through an own identity. They want to preserve this identity, and traditionally that is usually for hundreds of years they've been, or Germany has been their home, and within Germany they live in traditional areas. Being a member of a minority is the personal decision of each individual, and this cannot be registered or reviewed or denied by the state. Each of these four national minorities is defined by their own language above all. This is their identity and of special importance for the minority, and that's why these six minority languages, like Danish, North Frisian, Sartre Frisian, Romanish, Lower Sorbian, and Upper Sorbian, are especially protected. They are individual languages, and Low German is also specially protected, spoken in 8 of the 16 lands. The special legal status of national minorities and their languages, as well as the regional language Low German, is based on two agreements of the European Council, which are binding in Germany. This is the framework agreement to protect national minorities and the European Charter of Regional Minority Languages, which has been law since the 1st of January 1999 in Germany. The protection inscribed in both agreements is concretized and implemented at the federal and federal states level. Special attention is given to financial support by the government and the individual states. All four minorities are financially supported to maintain and preserve their language and culture. The federal states where those minorities reside contribute to promote national minorities. Regional language Low German is also supported by the federation and the individual lands where this language is spoken. These funds are guaranteed or granted to the respective societies and associations. And the lands do not only promote and support national minorities by direct funding, but also other measures that enhance their visibility in the population. That is, for instance, lessons taught in minority languages or about minority languages in the residing areas of the minorities. In some areas, like in the Sorbian Frisian residential areas, all signposts and signs are in two languages. Apart from financial support and other measures of non-financial character, there are regular meetings and contacts to the parliament and government of importance. This holds true for federal and state level. As the commissioner of the federal government, I am speaking about these. A very important task is accorded to the commissioner of the federal government for matters related to ethnic German resettlers and national minorities. He is a contact of the government national minorities. And this person presents the interests of national minorities and speakers of Low German to the federal government and fights for acceptance. There's a regular exchange with the minorities in the Ministry of the Interior for building and community. they do have consulting committees for national minorities and speakers of Low German. Those commissions or committees, they are representatives of minority associations of the federal government and of the respective federal states where these minorities reside. And members of parliament participate in those sessions. The national minorities in Germany have their own forum and body where they can present their matters to the government and look or discuss for common and joint ways to find solution. The Ministry of the Interior for Building and Community holds implementing conferences with representatives of national minorities, of speakers of Low Germany and the respective federal and land ministries, where those framework conventions and the European Charter for Minority Languages are being discussed regularly, and where regularly representatives of the European Council are invited to. At the German Parliament, there is a discussion round of national minorities and speakers of Low German, which is headed by the chair of the respective committee. There are other members of parliament who are interested and representatives of the federal government and representatives of the minority associations and the speakers group of Low German meet once a year for these discussion rounds. In order to protect the common interests of national minorities, the umbrella associations of those associations organized in the Minority Council. It has a minority secretariat in Berlin, which supports it, that has a comprehensive public relation work for the minorities in Germany. The Minority Secretariat is, of course, funded by the Ministry of the Interior, Building and Community, which all of you here know, I'm sure. As you can see, national minorities in Germany are very well organized, and at the political level, they have developed into important stakeholders. They are appreciated highly in Germany, and as partners of political responsible people, they are very important. I thank you very much for your attention. So this was a plaidoyer for minority protection in Germany. Now it would be important to listen to the opinions of the individual members of minorities. It was quite impressive, and Dr. Pfeil has the task to inform us about the regulations. Over to you.
That is my pleasure. But I realized during the preparation that it is not so easy to view politics without shedding some light on practice. And some of these points were mentioned. I think, or let me start like this. I start from the point of view of the European Council, because as a matter of fact, these two covenants, which were mentioned already, which we discussed yesterday, the Framework Covenant for the Protection of National Minorities and the Language Charter, both of them provide interesting and comprehensive standards which allow us to measure the German minority legislation. First of all, both covenants provide challenges on the level of individual human rights, which are very relevant for minorities, which include, in my opinion, the right to identity, including the right to your own confession. Among others, the right to use your mother tongue in private and in public, the general rights of freedom, like the freedom of movement, freedom of meeting, freedom of the media, of the press, which are very relevant also for national minorities, and to maintain cross-border contacts in private as well as on national level, the prohibition of discrimination, which is laid down in the German constitution, among others, the prohibition of discrimination due to origin, race, or language. All rights which I just named were relatively easily covered by the constitution. Spare me to name all these articles. Allow me one little comment. The European Council wishes, in respect to all countries which have ratified the Charter and the Covenant, if possible, to have figures on the minorities. This is tricky in Germany. The minorities don't want this, and this should be respected, definitely. I'd like to underline that theoretically it is possible, be it during a census or sociological countings, to get some idea in regard of figures. And it is important because only this enables the European Council or the states how efficiently the protection of minorities works. If I'm moving in a space without figures, I can't tell you whether there's enough education for pupils of minorities. Theoretically, if we respect free confession and the principle that these statements must be voluntary, and if people are forced to provide data which are not anonymous, this is not what we want. But in Germany, this is quite okay. The second level of minority rights, which is very important, refers to what Professor Gornick said, the level of so-called positive discrimination. So on that level, it is not enough to have protection rights against the state. This is where I need specific protections which require funding and very often institutional measures to be taken. The financial expenses refer to providing equality in culture, in economy, in education, in favor of the Sorbs, for instance, which have a foundation for the Sorbian people. And I heard with pleasure recently in Kiel that there soon will be a foundation for the Frisians in Schleswig-Holstein. It is a pity that the federal state of Lower Saxony did not join this initiative. It would have been a great thing that both federal states, both German Länder where Frisians live, would support this. Maybe this will come. This includes school classes, for instance, in these languages of the minorities, or at court, for instance, personal individual names and names of cities and villages shall be used. It refers to media, including online media, and support in cross-border contacts and authorities. This is an area in Germany which is covered by the regulations of the individual federal states. The federation covers only few points, or let me say federal legislation. On the level of the international law, we have the 1955 Copenhagen Declaration, which should be mentioned, where it says Germany agrees to protect the Danish minority, and the other way around, the Danish government obliges to protect the German minority in Denmark. There is the Reunification Treaty, which has paragraphs on the protection of the Sorbian minority, among others. In Article 184, sentence 2 of the court constitution law, which specifies that Sorbs are entitled to speak Sorbian in front of German courts. And another regulation which had been introduced in 1997, which still has a minor problem regarding the female form of Sorbian surnames. Slavic names, the female form ends with A, letter A usually. This was just a formal thing. And the Federal Election Act, which includes a 5% hurdle, which usually is of lower importance since the minorities in Germany are too small. And let me mention that there had been an initiative of 3 Länder of Lower Saxony, no, not Lower Saxony, Schleswig-Holstein, Saxony and Brandenburg, a new initiative in order to add a minority article to the German constitution, which unfortunately had not been accepted. I would have welcomed that. The substantiation says it would not have had a content-related effect, but it would have been a symbol to express the joint responsibility of the Federal Republic of Germany. This clause would have been: the state is respecting the identity of the autochthonous minorities and the protection of national minorities in Germany. So unfortunately, this initiative failed for the time being, but we will see what the future will bring. These areas, which can be summed up under positive discrimination, is covered by German federal state law. A quite positive example are the 3 federal states, Schleswig-Holstein, Brandenburg, and Saxony. Some countries, some Länder should make good, especially for the status of the Frisian minority. These 3 federal states included minority regulations in their constitutions. Let me just quote the Constitution of Schleswig-Holstein. This is, for instance, Article 6, free confession, the right to identity, cultural independence, state goal for political participation, protection, and support. And what I like in particular is that since 2014, in addition to the Danish and the Frisian minorities, also the minorities of the Sinti and Roma are covered by this Article 6 of the Schleswig-Holstein Constitution. School education is covered by the Schleswig-Holstein Constitution. Apart from that, Schleswig-Holstein has a law regarding the Frisian language, especially the use of the Frisian language at court. And let me mention a new paragraph 82 added in 2016 of the country's administrative law regarding Frisian and Danish, which can be used in certain districts and regions of the federal states in contact with authorities at administration. And let me mention the Schleswig-Holstein School Act and Election Act. In regard of the School Act, I'd like to underline that the rules for the Danish minority rely or are based on a network of private schools, Danish private schools, and Danish, the language will be strengthened in normal state-run schools soon. And in regard of these Danish private schools, only recently a certain point of dispute was solved in the positive. The point was, these schools, how are they supported? And the newly introduced Article 12, paragraph 5 says now, and guarantees that the funding of these private schools must be at a level comparable to the funding granted to public schools. So here again, progress in the right direction. The federal state Brandenburg provides basic clauses to promote identity, to maintain culture and language, the Sorbian language, the Low Sorbian as a special dialect, which is included in the constitution. The Brandenburg Sorbian Act had been revised in 2018 in a very profound way and was improved in regard of scope and depth. And let me mention the Administrative Court Procedure Act, which had been revised. And let me mention the School Act, Education Act in regard of the use of Low Sorbian as a language at school. And there are exceptions from the 5% clause. However, in practice, this act had not yet been applied. In Saxony, we have basic constitutions included in the Saxon constitution comparable to the Sorbian Act in Brandenburg, but not as comprehensive. If I remember this right, some tests had been launched to extend and improve this law on the Sorbian language and culture comparable to Brandenburg. But let me mention that the protection of the High Sorbian language works better. The High Sorbian as a language is at a better level than the situation for the Low Sorbian speakers in Brandenburg. And I think I have not the time to provide more legal facts here. I don't want to bore you with more paragraphs, but what is important in addition to the law and regulations, the further practical application and implementation of these acts on the level of administration. What's extremely important are plans for the implementation of the legal measures. For instance, action plan linguistic policy in Schleswig-Holstein and other initiatives. This means the theory which I briefly summarized in my paper will show its importance in practice. And when we have a look at the general situation in Germany, this could be summed up as follows. The situation of the minorities in Germany is relatively satisfying, but here again, there is still room to the top. For instance, I refer to the latest recommendations of the Committee of Ministers to Germany, and two areas must be underlined here, which are extremely important also internationally. This is education. Education is a signal, is essential for the further existence of minorities in general, and here the Committee of Ministers called upon to extend the education provided in regard of Low Sorbian in Brandenburg, of Frisian, and a second Frisian dialect in Schleswig-Holstein, and to improve the situation here in practice. There is a high demand for this, and it is essential to have teachers, trained, qualified teachers for these languages. This is another recommendation of the Council, the Committee of Ministers. Mr. What's his name, our Sorbian colleague who mentioned it yesterday. And here, this requires, how shall I put it? It requires flexible solutions, as he mentioned it yesterday. For instance, that in the further vocational training, Sorbian, the Sorbian language can be studied to qualify people as teachers who can then train pupils in Sorbian. And another area in Germany which requires improvement are the media, and here in particular radio, broadcasting, TV, online media in Germany, but there are still opportunities. What we can observe here is that the German authorities usually insist on the principle of the professional distance between radio, TV, and the state. They say they have only a restricted influence on radio and TV producers and cannot force these media. But Article 5 of the German Constitution is also a fundamental right. This means it is not just the level of fundamental rights at grassroots level. There is also the obligation of the state to provide diversity. And here diversity is so important, especially in view of the ratification of the two international conventions. So the distance between radio, TV, and the state is not an obstacle to introduce careful rules to improve the situation of minority languages in TV and radio. So we have regulations regarding the use of minority languages in authorities. What's lacking is practice. Very often speakers of minority languages do not know that they are entitled to use their own language, or because they are afraid that their proceedings will last too long. So here again, in practice, more information is required. All this, to give all this a positive framework. So if you use your language, you do something good. You do something to promote the diversity of the cultures and languages in Germany. And let me underline in this context how important it is to raise awareness in the majority population about the minorities and their languages. In Germany and in the population, there is all this is not known. Oh, sorry. And the last point, Roma are are still in a problematic situation. Discrimination needs to be overcome here. And the question is, in how far do Roma people want to speak their language in public? Thank you very much, Mrs. Pyle. This was a survey on the rules of the federal states and the federation. It was some criticism of the politics, and thank you for the suggestions. Allow me one remark. You listed the minority groups, both speakers, and the question is again and again, where do we see the Jews here? I must say the Jewish population does not want to be a minority. They say we are a religious community, we are Germans, there are Catholics and Protestants, and so are we a Jewish religious group, so they do not want to be under minority protection. Another point is that we have protection in Schleswig-Holstein and in Brandenburg. And what we need here is the protection of this here. So even animal protection was mentioned here. This is almost the same article. So we say, when we come to minority protection, the point is culture. It's the sovereignty of the federal states. So on federal level, we do not need specific rules here. And these regulations are based in the federation and in the federal states. So this is the principle of equality. So there are good arguments here to add minority protection into these sets of rules. It is a kind of cross-sectional clause, as we know it from the European regulations, but maybe it is not of major importance. So let me go on. We come to Poland now. And as we mentioned it yesterday, in the framework of the Cultural Foundation of German Police, the Professor Gornish is stopped. We treated minority protection by Poland or in Poland. There was some criticism, but we had been watching this over decades and came to the result that all this is exemplarily good at times, especially when you compare this to the other neighbors. France, for instance, where all the minority regulations and contracts are signed, but they insist we do not have minorities, you know. Let's come to Poland. I welcome Dr. Magdalena Lemańczyk of the Institute for Political Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences. Your presentation, please.
I would like to thank the hosts for the invitation and for being given the opportunity to talk about minorities in Poland and their protection. It's a very interesting and very important and complex topic, and it's very close to me and to your practice. In my voivodeship, Pomerania, and the town I live in, that is in Danzig, all recognized minorities in Poland live there, and Kashubian is a regional language used there. Before I start talking about details, let me give you an introductory remark. Of course, we do have legal frameworks in Poland, but in practice we do not have that many opportunity to implement them, in particular in education, which would be of utmost importance for minorities. And we do have legal gaps, of course. And when it comes to social political contexts and the approach of the Polish state and its institutions to minorities, it depends on that. Complying with minority rights in Poland is possible through international legal regulations. The law about national and ethnic minorities and regional language dated 6th January 2005 stipulates the groups that belong to national and ethnic minorities. National minorities are the following 9 minorities: White Russian minority, Czech, Lithuanian, German, Armenian, Russian, Slovak, and Ukrainian and Jewish minorities. Ethnic minorities are the 4 following minorities: Karaimic, Lampic minority, Roma minority, and Tatars. Beyond that, the law recognizes the community that uses the Kashubian language. And the most important legal regulations are, in chronological order, the Act dating back to 1989 is Association Act, which guarantees minorities the possibility to establish associations, participate free and equally in public life, and to preserve their culture and heritage. The Act dating back to 1993 on the educational system guarantees the possibility ethnic, religious, linguistic identity, in particular learning their own language and culture in schools and public institutions should be maintained. The Act from 1993 on broadcasting and TV obliges public media to broadcast programs in the languages of national minorities and ethnic groups and to take into consideration their needs. The Polish Constitution of 2nd April 1997, which also guarantees the freedom, development of own culture, maintenance and preservation of habits, and they guarantee the right to establish own educational and cultural institutions and institutions to protect religious identity and to participate in solving questions or issues of their cultural identity. An important aspect of minority rights is political participation. One example for granting participation rights is found in the Election Act from 1993, and there is a 5 percentage clause introduced for national minorities. And a bit earlier in 1990, the Ministerial Council in Mazowiecki region established the Committee for National Minorities, which is a counseling minority institution. As to fulfilling international standards for rights and freedoms of national minorities, the Republic of Poland signed the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, the European Charter of Regional and Minority Languages, and the UNESCO Convention to preserve the immaterial cultural heritage. Only with passing the Act on National and Ethnic Minorities and Regional Languages from 2005, it was stipulated to have certain defined rules, and this enables the members of a minority to freely use the minority language and to be allowed to write their full names according to the rules of minority languages. In municipalities where the minority has more than a 20% share, this language can get or obtain the status of an auxiliary language. That means when the minority members have contacts to authorities, they can use their mother tongue. In municipalities that meet this quota, they can have bilingual signs for places and streets, etc., where they meet all these criteria. The cultural rights of minorities are defined in the laws, and this obliges the state to support measures for maintaining identity of minorities. And last but not least, the Act also defines procedures in connection with learning minority languages and the right to be taught in the minority language. Finally, I'd like to say that in these minority laws, the a common commission was established. I introduced the general legal framework. Practice shows, however, what are the successes and the obstacles for certain minorities and what are the challenges in the near future for minorities. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. It was quite interesting, in particular for us Germans and also the Germans living in the areas or regions east of Oder and Neisse. And for Germans stemming from those areas, it's important to find German names of places. This should not be underestimated, even if the group of the former ex-police is passing away these days. Whether everything is as fantastic as it was mentioned here is going to be told us from a Polish view by somebody who lives in Poland. Mr. Gajda, over to you. We cannot hear you. The floor is yours, Mr. Gajda. I always forget to switch on the mic. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for being given this opportunity. I participated yesterday. I'm supposed to talk about the implementation of the rights of national minorities in Poland, and I would like to mention that thank you to Mrs. Lemańczyk, who at the beginning of her presentation said, not always there are or there is a variety of possibilities to implement, and that is where I would like to start. Passing a law on the rights of ethnic minorities and regional languages 15 years ago produced the possibility to define or to shape our reality. And it collected all the so far existing regulations and contributed by ending the discussion about how to write first and surnames. Article 12 gives you the right to use names of places and physical objects in minority languages apart from Polish language. And the Act stipulates certain preconditions that need to be fulfilled in order to be able to use those names. And the most important one is the 20% share of the population in a certain municipality. If this is a given, then the municipal council can apply without asking all inhabitants. But if the share is below 20%, there is still a possibility, but then you have to consult the inhabitants of the municipality first. But it would be wrong to think that just the law decides about the success. It produced a lot of doubts, and inhabitants of Radlau, were the first to overcome the resistance there. They had difficulties with procedures and funding, and unveiling the bilingual place name signs uh, um, took place only 2008, despite the fact that it was registered in December 2006 already. So it took 2 years from applying and granting the application to unveiling the signposts. And the unveiling of signposts of place names or signs of place names in Radlau, there was a lot of talk in the media about German revisionism and about German minorities, and numerous statements about the division of society, which would be brought about by these bilingual signs of place names. And those, the German minority in the municipality had a common conference or press conference which showed that bilingualism is a normal condition and not the exception in Europe. I myself showed photos of bilingual place names in Germany, Belgium, Hungary, and other countries in order to present this unknown standard. Nevertheless, during this conference, there were scandalous statements made by local politicians, and later on we realized that these changes in the public sphere were met with hostility, and the German names were crossed out at night in the beginning, or they were destroyed in any other way. Today, according to the Polish Ministry of the Interior and the administration, there are 59 municipalities with bilingual place names, out of which 31 municipalities have an additional German name. The others have additional names in Kashubian language, and here and there in Lithuanian, Lemtirian, and White Russian or Belarusian language. All in all, these are several hundreds of places and villages and towns which are witnesses of the culture. And after this law was in force for, or had been enforced for quite a number of years, the bilingual place names have become part and parcel of Kashubia, for instance, and elsewhere. It's rare that they are now destroyed. So this example shows you what role a good minority politics might play. Benefits and restrictions are reduced, and xenophobic approaches or ignorance are the reasons for that. So these are the consequences of a lacking education, let's say, um, where they do not tolerate or accept differences. Changes in the perception of bilingual name places show that you can have two different approaches. You can wait until there is a time when it is accepted in society, or you use the rights as an element of shaping a tolerant and open-minded view. But for this, you need a certain development. The example of physiographical names shows that the latest municipality where German names were introduced was Pavlovitsky. It was registered in September 2014, and as of today, there are 4 more applications that are not yet decided upon in the ministries, although they provided all prerequisites for bilingual place names. The long time of work upon it is a hindrance. When I think of language or the importance of languages for national minorities, I remember a quotation by Wilhelm of Humboldt: "The real home is the language." The remaining Germans in Poland, for instance, in reality, they were not allowed to use their language. And today we know that we as a community that was forced to assimilate, and the fact that we lost language in everyday life, we have to redevelop this language. And that's why protection is not enough, because our reality is we need to revive German as everyday life language. Many other minorities in Poland have similar issues or situation. The reports of expert commissions and the resulting proposals of the Ministerial Committee of the European Council for the European Language or Linguistic Charter and the application to the German minority are critical. Republic of Poland ratified this convention of the European Council on the 12th February of 2009. That is quite a few years after this law had entered into force. We are now working on the 3rd monitoring area. Towards the background of the fact that in education there have not yet been tremendous changes for minorities, I conclude that the report of the experts and recommendations given by the Council will repeat with the report from 2015, and they will probably state that teaching in primary and secondary schools will not have been complied with. In the school year 2016-17, German was learned by 52,914 students at school. So where does this negative evaluation by the European Council comes from? Poland obliged to have school students taught in German language where the German minority lives. In reality, the German students just learn German in the form of 3 additional German language lessons. only a reduced number of students can enjoy teaching in a bilingual way, and it is not possible to attend a school with German as instructing language. It's not, or it's possible that the next report of the expert commission might be even more critical, because the situation of the minorities in Poland, the number of students that learn German as a minority language has reduced for the first time. There have been changes that hinder an improvement of this situation, that I refer to the regulation from the ministry, which says that German as a foreign language in 7th and 8th classes is not allowed to be taught, which means that the number of hours and the quality reduced. And this is a reason for the reducing number of students learning German. And to be honest, we have to also add that during the form or past years, the government tried to change the situation qualitatively, but did not succeed. When the discriminating policy by Poland of forcing out the German language from public and private areas, then we need deep-rooted measures of a democratic state, exceeding maintaining and preserving measures. Finally, I'd like to say that I cut out two things, or mention two things or two issues that we have with our minority politics. All sessions between these councils or commissions between national minorities and government, we are discussing about lacking cultural institutions, the possibilities of using auxiliary or minority languages, and also using these languages in municipal councils and maintaining the cultural heritage. So there is a lot left to do, and the fact that there are states that solve problems in the interest of minorities that we still have to do, that it is the part of the politicians to enforce the use of higher standards. And yeah, that's it. So,
Dear Mr. Geider, thank you very much. So we've been following these developments for more than 20 years. There were not many things that improved. Allow me to make one remark. What disturbs me, for instance, when we come to Danzig, we as Germans love to read travel guides, and they speak about Gdansk and Wrocław, and when it's about the time before this, Germany is not mentioned. They refer to the people of Wrocław or the population of Gdansk. This is disturbing, and it falsifies history. So other people drew the attention to this. This should also be observed. Japanese people have no idea that Gdansk or Danzig used to be a free city of Danzig, or that it was German in the past. Thank you very much, Mr. Geider. Thank you very much for your commitment. We highly appreciate that you do a lot for the German minority group in Poland. And we heard that despite the Germans, there are other minority groups, the Kashubs, the Lantern, and so on, who have a similar fate. Now we're traveling. Thank you very much, Mr. Geider. Now we travel southward to Romania, and we all know the famous mayor of Hermannstadt of Sibiu used to be Johannes, who made this city flourish. And in Hermannstadt, he achieved a lot. He made it the cultural capital of Germany, of Romania. Now, Mr. Kalczak is president of the state of Romania. Johannes was a teacher. His wife was a German teacher. He speaks very good German still. He contributed, and allow me to mention this again, that in the area of Siebenbürgen, many Germans were elected mayors, although the German population was then a very small number only. And they said maybe the Germans can do it. Now our guest is State Secretary Lacica Edico Catalin, who will tell us about the regulations of minority protection in Romania. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is an honor to be here with you today and a privilege to have a short presentation about the Romanian legislative framework. As you said, I represent the Department for Interethnic Relations, which was founded in 1997. It was reorganized in 2005 as the specialized institution of the Romanian government in the field of the protection of national minorities.
Umsetzung der Minderheitenrechte und arbeiten bei der Analyse
towards minorities in the context of COVID-19 on the monitoring of the access of minorities to relevant information about the pandemic and the restrictions in their mother tongue on awareness raising about the effects of scapegoating and hate speech directed towards Roma community in particular. But we have also followed how education of minorities was affected, and we monitored the participation of minorities in local elections. During the past 30 years, the Romanian state developed a complex system of protection for national minorities. The system was the result of the hard work, the effective and constant and responsible participation of the minorities as well. Romania's accession to NATO and to the EU decisively marked the development of the protection of national minorities, since the effective implementation of equal opportunities and combating all forms of discrimination were underlying and fundamental prerequisites in the integration processes. In fact, with a few exceptions, the most important laws were adopted during these processes. Since there is no legal definition of the national minorities except for the electoral legislation, by custom and based on their historical background, the state recognizes 20 national minorities. According to the latest census held in 2011, it has a population of 20 million, out of which more than 10% belong to national minorities. The Romanian law includes a series of normative acts which approach exclusively national minorities' rights. The domestic law doesn't include the definition, as I said earlier, of the national minority, and there is no special legislation regarding the recognition as a distinctive minority group. But legal provisions were adopted in various fields such as education, culture, administration, media, and also the two relevant Council of Europe conventions were signed and ratified by Romania. Since I do not have the time to present in detail this complex institutional and legal framework, or to discuss the challenges in its application, I would like to shortly present a couple of examples which occurred during the past couple of months and which clearly had or will have an impact on the development of the protection of national minorities. These changes of the legislation and the challenges raised are nevertheless interdependent, And I believe that they are able to invite all the participants to reflect on the status of the legal protection of the minorities in Romania. Last year, the Administrative Codex was adopted by the Romanian government. The text was not consulted with the relevant stakeholders, including the Council of National Minorities. The ordinance abolished the existing legislation referring to local public administration, which contained the main linguistic rights of the minorities in their relation with the local public authorities. Although there are some provisions which correct the earlier gaps compared to the previous legislation, the new provisions are considered a step back, a regression in the linguistic rights of the minorities. For example, the text does not provide the norms for application, and the new legislation does not give the possibility to elaborate such legal text. Formulation of the rights is frequently ambiguous or vague, and due to the lack of application, as I said earlier, the application norms, the implementation of these rights becomes impossible. The rights are facultative. The emergency ordinance does not contain any kind of sanctions if the linguistic rights are not respected, and eventually it will cause the loss of previously gained linguistic rights, since these are conditioned by the percentage of the persons who belong to national minorities according to the last census. My reference to the census is not accidental. The government has recently adopted the legal framework for the upcoming census, which is highly important for the minorities as well, as ethnic and linguistic data collection is an important part of it. I would like to emphasize the importance of responsible data collection because we do need evidence-based policies which necessarily are built upon data. And we call upon responsible data collection and upon the importance of data protection. Data collection should not be discriminatory, but should be done by involving the minorities. Data should be collected so we can formulate policies that target groups and their specific concerns, or in Romania's case, it is a means to preserve certain rights as these are restricted to certain thresholds. Research show that in some cases the results of the census held in 2011 are not accurate. Specialists estimate, for example, that the number of Roma is at least double as according to the census, but also Tatars and Hungarians are shortened with at least 10,000 people. Although several proposals were submitted by our department since 2018, the legal framework adopted by the beginning of this year by the government did not include provisions, for example, related to the access of information in minority languages. With hard work, together with the minority organizations, we have managed to amend the legislation in the parliament, and therefore the legislative framework now applicable of the census refers to the fair access to information in minority languages about the census, to the possibility to collect data in 4 minority languages, German, Hungarian, Italian, and Serbian, and to have support materials translated in more than 10 minority languages. It also has the possibility of the access of the civil society observers, including minorities, to the whole process of the census, and so on. I believe that if correctly applied, the current legislation on census will ensure the correct information and the efficient voluntary participation of those who belong to national minorities. Last but not least, let me say a few words about the public participation of minorities and the applicable legislation. We recently had local elections, and the process of the parliamentary elections has already started. Although there is a misconception about the reserved seats in the parliament, the organizations of national minorities have to fulfill the legal conditions set up by the law in order to participate, and they have to pass a certain threshold. But the conditions are indeed considered an affirmative measure adopted to ensure their public participation. Both the law for the parliamentary elections and for the local authorities adopted in 2015 provides a system for their public participation rather innovative, and therefore it is a positive example as regards of participation of minorities in the political life. As I mentioned at the beginning, the department monitored the participation of minorities in local elections. Challenges occurred in reference with the definition of national minorities provided by the electoral legislation, but also in the lack of the correct information offered by the competent authorities about the legal conditions that organizations which were not part of the National Council of Minorities had to fulfill in order to participate. Although there were several cases in which the organization of minorities lost the local representation, overall the legislation permitted their fair and efficient participation. Nevertheless, during the pandemic and the state of the emergency, the period of emergency that we had, gave us once again the importance, that underlined the importance of the representatives of the minority in local authorities in informing the citizens. In those localities where the representation of the minority was strong and committed, regardless of its percentage, persons belonging to national minorities benefited to efficient access to information about the pandemic and about the measures taken by different authorities. As a conclusion, and based on these experiences, one of the biggest challenges we recognize at the department is the evolution of the minority rights. We strongly feel that the system is under constant change and that it always should be adapted to the reality and to the real needs of the minorities, also even more in times of crisis. We think that this adaptation, this constant development can and should be made with the direct contribution and involvement of the minorities, which is one of their key rights as well. I strongly believe that strong and respected minorities do strengthen the states they are part of as they increase the level of stability, security, and democracy. The responsibility, on the other hand, of the permanent dialogue with the representatives of minorities lies not only with them, but also with the authorities, political leaders, opinion makers, both nationally and on a European level. Promoting the contribution of minorities to the development of our societies requires knowledge and responsible recognition of the challenges and the problems they face. Thus, the greatest challenge, and at the same time our main attribution, is the responsible and objective representation of the specificity of the minorities, whether we are talking about the use of mother tongue, education, individual rights, or their collective exertion in consensus with observant citizens' rights and for the benefit of them. Thank you for your attention.
Liebe Frau Katalin, haben Sie vielen Dank für Ihren Vortrag. Wir haben jetzt wieder gesehen, dass eigentlich diese Minderheitengruppe, die einen Staat hinter sich haben, also zur Gruppe der nationalen Minderheiten gehören, sich etwas leichter tun. Die deutsche Minderheit, die ungarische Minderheit, die russische Minderheit, die es auch in Rumänien gibt, die haben immer noch einen Staat, der sich für sie einsetzen kann. Aber sie haben ja auch in Rumänien Minderheiten wie die Huzulen, die Lipowaner und so weiter. Aber vor allem, Sie haben es ja auch erwähnt, die Roma, die haben niemand, der sich für sie einsetzt. Und deswegen müssen wir, soweit es um diese Gruppen geht, ich habe jetzt nur 3 als Beispiele genannt, es sind noch einige mehr zu erwähnen, auch auf internationaler Ebene vielleicht noch etwas mehr für diese tun. Vielen Dank. Und weil uns die Zeit davonläuft, will ich jetzt sehr schnell überleiten zur Praxis. Herr Dr. Pampor, der Vorsitzende des Demokratischen Forums der Deutschen in Rumänien, Sie haben das Wort.
Chairman of the Democratic Forum of Germans in Romania, over to you. Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard how the legal situation is regarding minority protection in Romania. Now, how does this look like in practice? Unfortunately, we do not have a Minority Protection Act in Romania, although there were lots of proposals and suggestions on the part of the Hungarian Association and of the Democratic Forum of Germans in Romania. Despite the lack of such a law, the Romanian state promotes and protects its altogether 18 ethnic minorities. There are 2 big ones, the Hungarians and the Roma, and 16 so-called small minorities with several thousands of members. The Hungarians have their own representatives in the Senate, in the parliaments. The 16 small minorities have, thanks to the very permissive Romanian legislation, deputies who form their own parliamentary group. This could be seen as a European model, where all minorities have representatives on the highest political level. The groups enjoy promotion of their culture. They have their own press and media. They enjoy funding, quite essential numbers of funds. The Germans have the only German newspaper in Southeast Europe. There are 2 German theaters, even more Hungarian theaters, and a Jewish theater in Bucharest. Olajva has a Romanian and a Hungarian opera. And the state TV, there's broadcasting in Romanian and German. The minorities have schools where they learn in their own language. The best example is the university in Klausenburg with more than 30 chairs or courses of studies for Hungarian language, and 10 where lecturers teach in German, to ensure that the Romas have more intellectuals in their groups. They are positively discriminated. In certain schools and universities, there are extra vacancies for Roma, and just because they're Roma, they are admitted to these universities without an admission test. So, in a nutshell, I can say that despite the lack of a minority protection legislation, the ethnic minorities in Romania are promoted more than in some other regions in Europe. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. Por. This is a surprising finding for all of us, but being one who's very often at the Romanian university and who has many friends in Romania, I fully agree with you here. And simply the fact that in some Transylvanian villages, we even have German mayors, although the German population is quite small. Most of them left the country during the Ceausescu era. And this shows that minority protection works, and that it is implemented in practice. Thank you very much for this finding, which is a surprise for many of us. But we hear a lot of criticism about Romania. So it is really a pleasure to get a positive message on your country. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Now we travel on to Slovenia. We're towards the Adriatic Sea, westward. And we will have a look at Slovenia. Professor Mitja Zagar of the Institute of Ethnic Studies, over to you.
In Europe with promotion of the minority package and other initiatives that can actually lead in this direction. First, I would like to say a few words on some conceptual issues. The protection and rights of minorities were considered important issues in the time when Slovenia became independent, and also in promotion of the new state in the international community, particularly in the time of accession to the EU. In this context, it was important that in a process of transition to democracy and democratization, Slovenia pointed to the importance of minority protection and minority rights, also in the context of the Copenhagen criteria. And in this context, Slovenia stressed that it was one of the most successful states actually following the highest standards in the protection of national minorities. Slovenia was actually building on relatively good reputation of the former Yugoslavia that was considered one of the champions of minority rights within the UN and international community. Internally speaking, in Slovenia, it is important to note that Slovenia, in the process of independence, in its constitutional charter that specified and spelled out directions and principle of its future development, ensured national minorities and persons belonging to them that following the principle of acquired rights, their existing rights will be preserved and protected. Respecting this pledge, the Constitution of the Republic Slovenia regulates and guarantees the protection of and special rights of the Hungarian and Italian national minorities and their members in Article 64, then of the Roma in Article 65, as well as the rights of every individual to express their affiliation, identity, and culture, use their language and script in private and public and before state institutions in Articles 61 and 62. It is important to note that these were at the time the standards that were established for the persons belonging to national and ethnic minorities internationally. Additionally, which is also important, the Constitution prohibits any incitement of ethnic, racial, religious, and other inequality and intolerance, violence, and war. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution of the Republic of Slovenia, it was decided that in regulating minority rights and protection, the highest international standards would be followed and exceeded when already existing level of protection was actually higher than these standards. Also, Slovenia has become a party to European Charter, Linguistic Charter, and to the Framework Convention. It is important to know that in addition to the principle of acquired rights, also some other contexts were discussed in the context of the adoption of the Constitution and then building up of the minority protection. And basically, it is so that also at these discussions, some current theoretical and political discussions were actually taken into account. And basically the following concepts were discussed. The first one was the concept of the types and of ethnic and other minorities and their protection. And consequently already the Constitution of Slovenia actually introduces three basic categories. The first one, following the principle of the protection of acquired rights, in Article 64, the Constitution guarantees the protection, special rights, and participation of the Hungarian and Italian national minorities and persons belonging to them. In this context, the rights of those minorities are determined both as individual rights of persons belonging to those minorities, as well as collective rights of those minority communities that the Constitution defines as autochthonous national communities. It is important to note that their protection is actually provided regardless of their number. It is also important to note that Hungarian and Italian language respectively are declared official languages in the territory of the autochthonous settlement of those minorities. With regard to the Roma communities, the Constitution in Article 65 states that their position and rights is regulated by the law, and later on the adequate regulations in the legal system were actually adopted. And thirdly, the Constitution does not mention directly other minorities, including these from the other former republics of the former Yugoslavia, immigrants, but also traditional minorities, relatively small ones that are present in Slovenia, such as the German-speaking minority Jews, for example. However, again, as already mentioned, the Article 61 and 62, in accordance with the highest standards of the time, ensured the protection of persons belonging to other ethnic communities, rights to express their ethnic affiliation, identity, and culture, use the language and script in private, public, and before state institutions. The second complex of issues that was discussed was the issue of nature of minority rights. And here it is important to note that although in international law and in the majority of the countries, actually minority rights are treated as individual rights of persons belonging to national, ethnic, and other minorities. In Slovenia, actually already in the constitution for the two national minorities that were mentioned, these rights are established as both individual rights of persons belonging to those communities and collective rights of those communities. And here I would like to add that in addition to that, although other minorities do not actually enjoy special collective protection, they do actually enjoy individual protection if their members, persons belonging to them, actually desire to exercise them. So they have the right to express their affiliation, to use their language, to develop and promote their culture. And it is also important to note that certain funding, although in my view insufficient, is provided for those issues. The third complex issues actually refers to different concepts of protection of minorities that were discussed and to a certain extent also implemented in Slovene constitutional and legal regulation. The first issue is the issue of the protection of ethnic and national minorities. Namely, for the two national minorities, the territorial protection was actually introduced, providing that those minorities actually enjoy all the rights in the territory of their traditional settlement. And this actually includes rights not only to use the language, but to have the language also as official language in the communes where they traditionally live, the right to bilingual science and topographic science, and it is also important that they have also guaranteed rights to participation and representation in the communes where they live. However, the problem with the territorial protection is that the protection only is enforced in the territory where those minorities traditionally live. The moment a member of a minority leaves this territory, also those rights are no longer guaranteed. So in Slovenia, it was discussed, although it was not fully implemented in its legislation, that also the personal and functional concept of the protection of minorities should be considered so that persons belonging to minorities would enjoy certain rights regardless of the territory in which they would want to enjoy them within the Republic of Slovenia. The next issue that was also discussed and that there was no consensus was the issue whether the same concept of the protection should be applied for all minorities or that there should be different concepts of minorities that would be applied for different minorities. Although frequently the same concept of protection and equal rights are advocated for different, possibly all ethnic minorities in a certain country, I would argue that their situation, position, needs, and interests often differ and might even require different approaches. I would suggest that a list or a menu of specific minority rights and concepts of protection of minorities that combine territorial, functional, and personal concepts of protection should be developed, and that individual minorities would be given the chance and the right to choose from the list and rights those concepts and those rights that serve their position, status, and needs and interests the most. Consequently, for each minority, specific minority protection would be established and guaranteed, providing that all minorities and persons belonging to them enjoy minimal standards of minority rights and protection. The next issue that was discussed was the issue of negative and positive protection. And here we should say that the majority of the states that actually introduced minority protection opts for the so-called negative concept, which basically includes the prohibition of violation of rights of minorities and provides for protection of those rights before courts and in other official procedures. However, in Slovenia, it was discussed and to a certain extent already introduced in the constitution that positive concepts of protection of minorities should be followed, thereby establishing also the responsibility and duty of states to actually establish conditions for realization, for materialization of rights of persons belonging to minorities and minorities as collective entities, which is the case of the two national minorities, Italian and Hungarian, and to a certain extent the Roma minority in Slovenia. These constitutional provisions were then actually elaborated and further developed by the legislation, and there are, in addition to the three laws that directly regulate the organization status and participation of Italian and Hungarian and Roma communities, more than 150 laws that actually in specific fields guarantee and regulate specific protection and rights of minorities. However, in addition to that, we also have the statutes of the communes where minorities live that provide for their participation and certain rights. All these provisions that were mentioned establish a complex system. However, it is not always coherent and complete. Particularly, I would like to mention that occasionally, and this will be addressed later on by my colleagues, there is a gap, sometimes quite substantial, between the normative regulation and the normative arrangements and the actual position and situation of minorities. In addition to those legally binding documents, there are also different policies, declarations, programs, and decisions, both at the national and local level, that complement this normative system. Although insufficiently, in my view, they include also contents that relate to the protection of other minorities and persons belonging to them, including new minorities such as immigrant communities and communities of persons belonging to nations and nationalities of the former Yugoslavia. Although the status and protection and position and rights of the Hungarian and Italian national minorities and persons belonging to them are often considered exemplary, also by the international organizations and different minorities, we should mention that there might be not only a gap in actually realizing those rights and in the actual and in their actual situation, but also in providing the rights and in realizing all the needs and interests of persons belonging to other minorities communities. And again, here I would like to mention that within Ministry of Culture and in the field of culture, there are relatively good arrangements, however, particularly the funding in this respect, in my view, is insufficient. Arguing that the rights and protection of minorities, regardless of their size, should always be guaranteed and materialized, I agree that the protection should constantly develop and expand in order to ensure the full inclusion and integration of minority communities as collective entities, as well as persons belonging to them as individuals. However, considering their specific situation, needs, and interests, I would again stress also the need to ensure the minimal standards for all minorities and persons belonging to them, but at the same time also enable that each of the minority communities would actually enjoy the protection that would be the best suited to this specific community and to persons belonging to it. However, at the same time, I would also like to stress that minorities, regardless of their size, even the smallest ones, are never completely homogeneous, and that there is always a certain level of plurality and diversity that exists within the minorities, and therefore we should also expect that within minorities there would be different interests and needs. And finally, I would like to stress that we should actually somehow get rid of the traditional approaches that frequently consider minority issues the issues of security. And I would like to stress that this concept of securitization that somehow was introduced in the public discourse after 9/11 should be actually replaced by the discourse of inclusion, integration, and providing the basis for actually inclusion on the basis of the principle of acquired value, additional value that this diversity that the different minorities present actually brings to every society. Thank you.
Herr Chagar, haben Sie herzlichen Dank. Innerhalb der Europäischen Union gilt ja Slowenien immer als ein Musterknabe, als ein Musterland. Wir haben eigentlich jetzt, soweit es um den Minderheitenschutz geht, eigentlich auch gar nichts anderes erwartet, dass es alles sehr, sehr schön ausschaut. Sie haben auch besonders betont, das möchte ich jetzt auch nochmal unterstreichen, dass dieser Minderheitenschutz ein
that minority protection is a continuous process. We can never be satisfied. We are always facing new challenges, and that is what we need to consider in practice and in politics and in science. Whether everything is as nice as you mentioned, you talked about gaps. We do have two speakers, Ms. Lara Sorgo and Attila Kovac from the Institute of Ethnic Studies.
Good afternoon.
Over to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the invitation and giving me the opportunity to present some practical aspects of the implementation of minority rights in the Republic of Slovenia. I must also say that this contribution is actually a truly joint effort of the different research topics of my colleagues at the Institute. I will start briefly with the constitutionally recognized and autochthonous Italian and Hungarian national communities, and then I will talk about the Roma and German communities. So the Italian and the Hungarian national communities are classical minority communities, which means that the implementation of special minority rights is primarily related to the territory traditionally inhabited by their members. The protection of these two minorities is largely linked to the notion of ethnically mixed area, the area comprising the territories of those settlements within an individual municipality where the members of the autochthonous Italian and Hungarian national communities reside. The historical settlement area of the Italian national community in Slovenia covers the littoral, a part of the Slovenian Istria. The area of autochthonous settlement of the Hungarian national community instead covers a narrow strip of territory along the Slovenian-Hungarian border, the Prekmurje region. Although the legislative framework for the protection of autochthonous national communities is well developed and comprises a number of regulations governing the status of the two communities, this does not mean that they are effectively implemented and enforced. Nevertheless, it is worth pointing out the well-established visible bilingualism in the ethnically mixed areas, which is slightly better regulated in the littoral than in Prekmurje. Attention to the reality of their everyday life was most often drawn by community members themselves, who also sought help from their respective institutions. These institutions have repeatedly pointed out problems and inconsistencies in the implementation of legislation over the past years. The biggest gap between legislation and practical implementation of has been observed in relation to the use of minority languages, so the Italian and Hungarian, which in the ethnically mixed areas have the status of official languages. In 2014, the National Assembly's Commission for the National Communities established a working group within the Commission and prepare an action plan for the implementation of regulation in relation to bilingualism for 3 years, till 2018. It has been found that, in the period under consideration, certain inconsistencies in the official and public use of Italian or Hungarian languages have been eliminated, but there has been no sufficient progress in practice, which affects the preservation of identity and mother tongues of autochthonous national communities. Despite the fact that public employees are entitled to a bilingualism bonus, most of the employees are only able to provide general information in the minority language, while some do not speak the language at all. As a result, members of national communities often have to adapt and use Slovenian in official procedures. Nevertheless, it also needs to be pointed out that the administrative units provide forms and e-forms also in Italian and Hungarian, and that the state administration portal is available in these two languages as well. The above issues have not gone unnoticed by scientific institutions, specifically the Institute for Ethnic Studies, that has run several projects related to the implementation of institutional bilingualism. For example, the ongoing project Institutional Bilingualism in Ethnically Mixed Areas in Slovenia, evaluation of the bilingualism bonus. Education for members of the Italian and Hungarian national communities takes place under the Slovenian educational system. Its goal is to create the conditions for the members of national communities to preserve their linguistic and cultural identity and develop appropriate language competencies for understanding the neighbor's language. A monolingual school system has thus been designed for members of the Italian national community, which means that teaching takes place in Italian. Learning Slovenian is also mandatory. Teaching materials are all in Italian and the curriculum is adapted to the need of the community. Quite often, teachers themselves translate curricula and materials, rules for school competitions, forms, and other documents. School regulations are in fact only written in Slovenian. In the bilingual area of Prekmurje, where the Hungarian national community lives, education is provided in bilingual schools, with classes held in both Slovenian and Hungarian. Such methodology allows children to learn both languages and the culture of the other nation. The concept of bilingual schools envisages teaching staff that speak both languages at a very high level, which is not always the case in practice. The language competencies of some teachers in Hungarian are scarce. In order to overcome these deficiencies, the Ministry of Education has been financing since 2011 projects whose main goal is to raise the level of teachers' competencies in the Hungarian language in bilingual schools. An additional problem is the fact that less and less children are learning Hungarian as their mother tongue, as the parents mostly sign them up for groups where Hungarian is taught as the language of the environment. Despite a very good legal protection of the national communities, an umbrella law of the national communities that would regulate the numerous legal acts in a comprehensive and transparent manner has not been adopted yet. As for the members of the Roma community, they predominantly live in the border areas of northeast and southeast Slovenia. Besides that, they are also present in some larger cities. Although the 1991 Constitution of the Republic of Slovenia stipulated that the status and special rights of the Roma community in Slovenia were to be regulated by law, the Roma Community Act was not adopted until 2007. One of the most important rights enjoyed by Roma is political representation. In 20 municipalities, Roma have the right to elect their own representatives to the municipal council. Roma have been able to exercise this right since 2002 local elections. However, the criteria for the selection of the said municipalities, where according to the wording of the law, an autochthonously settled Roma community resides, were not specified when the list of municipalities where the autochthonous Roma community reside was made up. So it is not clear why some municipalities drop out of the list, although, according to professionals, Roma have been historically present there as well. In the mentioned 20 municipalities, about a third of the members of the Roma community do not have such right, as they live outside the mentioned municipalities, especially in urban areas, and are mostly immigrants or descendants of immigrants from the republics of former Yugoslavia. As regards political representation of the Roma community at the state level, the Roma Community Act provides for the Council of the Roma Community of the Republic of Slovenia. This council represents the interest of the Roma community in Slovenia in relation to state bodies, and it performs various tasks and deals with issues related to the interests, status, and rights of the Roma community in Slovenia, the preservation of the Roma language and culture, as well as the establishment and preservation of contacts with Roma organizations worldwide. Yet in practice, the council does not have any noteworthy powers. In addition, unusual criteria have been set for who can be elected to the council. 1/3 of the council members are representatives of the above-mentioned members of municipal councils, while 2/3 of the members are representatives of one of the Roma association that also has members from municipalities with non-autochthonous Roma, despite the fact that autochthony is a requirement posed by the state. Regarding the German community, the issue concerning the regulation of the state of the German-speaking population in Slovenia was officially raised by Austria in 1992, a year after Slovenia's independence. In 2001, the cultural agreement between Slovenia and Austria was signed, which provides for the inclusion of cultural, educational, scientific, and other projects of the German-speaking population in Slovenia among interstate relations. Representatives of the German-speaking ethnic community in Slovenia repeatedly called for the regulation of their legal status. In 2011, a delegation of the Association of Cultural Societies of the German-speaking ethnic community in Slovenia was received in the National Assembly and highlighted the problem of non-recognition of the German-speaking ethnic community in Slovenia as an autochthonous national community. It also expresses the wish for its status to be regulated, which would simplify their activity and cultural existence. Unfortunately, the support that Slovenia provides to German speakers on the basis of Austrian-Slovenian agreement does not suffice to meet the needs of the societies engaged in preserving and developing the linguistic and cultural identity of the German-speaking ethnic group in Slovenia. Over the past few years, Austria has started to make clearer and more decisive demands regarding the regulation, actually the recognition of the German community in Slovenia. From 2012 until nowadays, the Austrian Parliament, its committee, adopted a decision committing Austria to strive for the recognition of the German minority in Slovenia. The dispersion of Germans, Austrians, and German-speaking population presents some practical opportunities to preserve their ethnic and cultural image. These certainly include the possibility for members of the German-speaking population to learn their mother tongue from primary school onwards, where German is taught. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt because of time, and there are questions that arose, and it is in particular about the minority situation in Slovenia. And Mr. Košik asked, when can we ask for or think of the acceptance of Hungarian, Italian, and Roma and Sinti minorities in Slovenia? And he was lacking the information about the German minority, and Ms. Feil was also asking, is it enough to have general conventional rights or constitutional rights? They are not enough, and there needs to be a guarantee for Article 7 of the Linguistic Charter. And maybe let me go over to the question round. Are you able to maybe tell us something more about these things?
Well, regarding the German-speaking minority, it's not really my research topic at the Institute because I'm dealing with the Italian national community. Maybe Professor Jagar knows something more.
Mr. Jagar, can you comment on this?
For quite a while in Slovenia. Namely, the problem of the protection of the minorities in Slovenia is a broader issue. And I already mentioned some issues with regard to the concepts of the protection that were actually discussed. And obviously, due to dispersed settlement of the German-speaking minority, as well as some other minorities in Slovenia, it will be basically impossible to actually implement the territorial protection of minorities, which is actually introduced for Italian and Hungarian national minorities, which actually live in traditional historic territory of their settlement. And so the question whether we can apply the same type of the protection was also raised. And at that time, it was actually considered that for those minorities that actually live dispersed in the territory of the whole country, such as, for example, majority of those communities from the former Yugoslav republics, as well as German speaking, we will have to actually find an additional concept that would actually allow for their protection. And I would say that here, particularly from the perspective of scholars that have studied this, we came up with the idea of the functional and personal protection, meaning that, for example, the right to education, the right to information, and other minority rights would actually be provided for the persons belonging to those minority communities, regardless of the territory or place of their settlement in the whole territory of the Republic of Slovenia. However, we should also point out that there was no political consensus that such a regulation could be adopted within Slovene legislation and constitution. There were also initiatives to actually amend Slovene constitution in order to ensure similar level of protection also for the minorities coming from other parts of the former Yugoslavia. And again, there was no political consensus. And this was particularly the reason why the scholars who actually, we are aware of these problems, actually tried to promote the idea of additional concepts of minorities that will be introduced in addition to territorial protection of two national minorities, and in addition to the protection of Roma communities that, although slightly more dispersed, still live slightly more concentrated in.
Vielen Dank, Herr Chaga. Ja, vielen Dank. Ich muss auch auf die Zeit schauen. Wie bei den normalen Tagungen überziehen wir natürlich auch hier digital. Das hätte mich auch gewundert, wenn es anders gekommen wäre. Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, auch liebe Studenten in Innsbruck, vielen Dank, dass Sie am Ball geblieben sind, hoffe ich doch.
Very much that you're still with us. In the first, you experienced a minority protection conference of FUEN and the cultural foundation of the German expellees, and we do hope that in a second conference, hopefully after the pandemic, you will again be our virtual guests. The results which we found are quite satisfying once you have been observing minority protection since the wall came down. Since 1990, lots of things improved, as we saw from the Romanian example, where we didn't expect it, or when we look at Slovenia, where we expected this. We have 400 European minority communities in Europe, 100 million people. That means a vast group of people belongs to minorities. That means also that we are facing an enormous task here, not only in the framework of this conference, to focus on other countries as well. I mentioned France already, and there are other countries, Hungary, Spain, Italy. They were not forgotten. We will hopefully deal with all these countries in the course of the coming year. Thank you very much for your attention, for your willingness to join the conference digitally. I wish you all the best, and stay safe and stay careful. Bye-bye. Thank you very much. See you next time. Thank you very much, Mr. Gornick. Before we all go and leave, I'd like to thank all the speakers and participants of the conference. We had 2 intense days with very successful presentations. We wanted to give a survey on how minority protection works in various countries and how members of minority groups are experiencing the situation. I belong to the German minority in Hungary, and therefore protection of minority groups is a matter of the heart for me. I'm very glad that despite the health situation at the moment, we were able to hold this conference, unfortunately in a different framework, but even this virtual format was a good solution. We do hope to continue this format. Therefore, I express my thanks to the Federal Ministry of the Interior for the financial support, and I thank my colleagues, my FUEN colleagues very much, and the colleagues of the Cultural Foundation. So thank you very much for your time, and I wish all of you a good evening. Stay safe. Hope to see you soon. And now, Mr. Kohnhäuser, over to you. Thank you very much. I fully agree with what you said. I thank you very much. I express my thanks to all the participants and speakers, and of course to FUEN, to you, to your colleagues for the wonderful organization. I think these 2 days showed it. Thank you for the fruitful, substantial cooperation between the Cultural Foundation of the German Ex-Police for Science and the Forum of German Nationalities, where we saw that this conference joined theory and practice, and Dr. Pfeil underlined it yesterday, how important follow-up conferences are. And in this sense, it is of major importance to continue this event format and to look at all the other European countries. I thank you very, very much. I thank the Federal Ministry for the financial support of our conference. Thank you, Mr. Gornich, Professor Gornich. I thank the moderator of yesterday, who is not here today. And I do hope that after the pandemic, we will have a follow-up conference in person. So thank you very much. Stay safe. Bye-bye.